You think you know how a story's going to go. A mother, a sick child, a race against time. You've heard it before. But let me tell you, the story of Nora Matthews and the ride to Sweetwater, it starts like that. It starts with the thunder of hooves and the desperate pounding of a mother's heart. But that's not where it ends. Not even close. The Arizona Territory in 1883 was no place for the weak, and Nora Matthews was anything but. For 3 days and 3 nights, she'd been fighting a war in her tiny, isolated homestead. A war against a fever that was trying to steal her 5-year-old son, Billy. His little body was a furnace. His breasts were shallow, ragged things. She'd used every remedy she knew, every prayer she had. Nothing worked. Before the sun even thought about rising on the 4th day, a new terror gripped her. A rattling sound from Billy's chest. A struggle for every single breath. That was it, the breaking point. She couldn't wait for her husband, Robert, gone 3 long years now. She couldn't wait for a miracle. She had to make one. She threw a blanket on her exhausted mare, wrapped Billy in another, and burst out into the pre-dawn chill. 20 miles. 20 miles to Sweetwater, to the only doctor for 100 miles around. Every single hoofbeat was a drum pounding out the same rhythm. Too late, too late, too late. Her mare, faithful and strong, was starting to fail. The distant cluster of buildings on the horizon seemed to get farther away, not closer. Nora's vision blurred with tears, with exhaustion, with a terror so pure it was like ice in her veins. "Hold on, Billy," she whispered into the blanket, her voice cracking. "Mama's here. Just hold on." A weak moan was his only answer. The heat from his little body was terrifying. They finally stumbled over the last rise. Sweetwater. The main street was already teeming with life. Wagons, horses, people. A chaotic maze stood between her and Dr. Henderson's office. Her mare faltered, its legs buckling. Foam flecked its muzzle. They were at the edge of town, and they were done. "Help!" she cried, but her voice was a whisper lost in the noise. "Please, my son is sick." Despair crashed over her, a cold black wave. Was this it? Was this where her fight ended? At the edge of salvation, but unable to reach it? And then, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice like rolling thunder. "Stand aside, make way." The crowd just parted, like the Red Sea. Through the newly formed path rode a man on a stallion as black as a starless night. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by the sun, his eyes a piercing blue under the shadow of his hat. In a single fluid motion, he was beside her, his strong hand steadying her just as her mare gave its last ounce of strength and collapsed. "The child needs a doctor," Nora gasped, clutching Billy like a lifeline. The stranger didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He reached down and lifted them both, mother and child, onto his own horse, as if they weighed nothing. He wrapped one powerful arm around her waist, holding them secure. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice a deep, steady rumble. He turned his mount. "Clear a path. Sick child coming through." People scattered. The world became a blur of faces and storefronts as they galloped down the street. Gratitude surged through Nora, so powerful it almost choked her. This man, this complete stranger, was an answer to a prayer she didn't even have time to utter. "Name's Jake Turner," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the hooves. "What's wrong with the boy?" "Fever," she managed, feeling Billy's labored breaths against her chest. He can't breathe." Jake's jaw was set like stone. He pulled his horse to a sharp halt in front of a whitewashed building. "Dr. Henderson, physician." Before she could even think to move, Jake had dismounted, lifting her and Billy down as gently as if they were made of glass. He kicked the door open. "Doctor," he boomed, "emergency here." The next few hours were a whirlwind. Dr. Henderson, a man with a kind, weathered face, took one look at Billy and his expression turned grave. "Severe pneumonia," he said. He worked quickly, preparing medicines, hot compresses, his movements efficient and calming. Through it all, Jake Turner never left her side. He wasn't just a silent presence. He was a force. He fetched water, built up the fire, his quiet support a rock for Nora to cling to in the storm of her fear. She hadn't known how much she needed someone, anyone, until he was there. By nightfall, the crisis had passed. Billy's fever had broken, just slightly. The doctor warned he wasn't out of the woods, not by a long shot. "He needs constant care," Dr. Henderson said, polishing his spectacles. "I can't let you take him back to the homestead, Mrs. Matthews. He needs to stay here in town, where I can watch him." Nora's heart, which had just started to beat normally, plummeted. I I don't have money for a hotel room." The words were ash in her mouth. The shame of her poverty was a physical weight. "You'll stay at the boarding house," Jake said firmly. It was the first time he'd spoken in hours. "I've already spoken to Mrs. Holloway. A room is ready for you." "But I can't possibly." "You can and you will," he interrupted, his gaze leaving no room for argument. "Your boy needs rest, and you look like you're about to fall over." There was something in his eyes, a mixture of raw kindness and an authority that she found impossible to question. Too tired, too emotionally shattered to argue, she just nodded. Jake carefully lifted the sleeping Billy from the examination table. The walk to the boarding house was short. Mrs. Holloway, a plump, motherly woman, showed them to a clean, simple room. After she left, Nora turned to Jake, who was gently placing Billy on the bed. The question that had been burning inside her finally spilled out. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing all this? You don't know us." Jake straightened up. In the soft lamplight, she saw the details of his face for the first time. A faint white scar along his jaw. Lines around his eyes that spoke of things seen, things endured. "My sister," he said, his voice quiet and simple. "Her and her boy. They died of a fever 3 winters ago. I wasn't there to help them." He looked from Billy, sleeping peacefully, to her. "But I'm here now." He moved toward the door, turning his hat over in his hands. "Get some rest, Mrs. Matthews. I'll check on you both in the morning." And then he was gone. Nora sank onto the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. She touched Billy's forehead, still warm, but not the raging inferno of before. For the first time in days, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout in the barren wasteland of her heart. Her last thought before sleep finally dragged her under was of the stranger, the kind man with the sad story and the piercing blue eyes. The man who seemed too good to be true, because, as she would soon learn, he was. The next morning, Nora woke to sunlight and the unfamiliar sounds of town. Billy was awake, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Mama," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I'm thirsty." Tears of relief stung her eyes. As she helped him sip some water, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Jake. In his hand was a small, exquisitely carved wooden horse. "Thought the little man might like some company," he said, a hint of awkwardness in his confident demeanor. Billy's eyes went wide. Jake placed the toy in his small hands. The gesture was so thoughtful, so unexpectedly tender, it stole Nora's breath. "Thank you," she said. "It's perfect." "Jake," he corrected with a small smile. "And you're Nora." A simple understanding passed between them, but just as the fragile connection began to form, Dr. Henderson arrived. He examined Billy, his expression cautiously optimistic. "He's responding well," the doctor declared, "but he'll need at least a week of rest here in town." A new worry creased Nora's brow. "My homestead, the animals, the garden." "I'll ride out," Jake offered immediately, as if he'd read her mind. "I can handle a cow and some chickens. Just give me directions." She studied him, this man who was becoming indispensable. "Why would you do that? You have your own business here." Jake just shrugged his broad shoulders. "Nothing that can't wait. Came to Sweetwater for a fresh start. Seems helping you might be part of it." He said it so simply, but Nora felt there were entire chapters hidden behind that one sentence. Over the next week, a strange new routine took hold. Jake would ride out to her homestead every morning and return in the afternoon, bringing fresh eggs and milk and news of her small patch of the world. He took care of everything, and for Billy, he brought stories, tales of wild mustangs and fighting bears in the Colorado mountains that made her son's eyes shine with wonder. One evening, as Jake was spinning a yarn, Nora found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh. It felt foreign in her own ears. Jake paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Your mama's got a pretty laugh," he said to Billy, but he was looking straight at Nora. "Don't reckon I've heard it enough." A blush crept up her neck. "There hasn't been much to laugh about." "Then we'll have to find some reasons," he replied, his voice soft. That night she stood by the window, watching the stars. For the first time since her husband Robert died, she wasn't just thinking about surviving. She was thinking about living, and she was thinking about Jake Turner. It was dangerous. He was a drifter. Men like him never stayed. But still, her heart wondered. At the end of the week, Dr. Henderson declared Billy well enough to go home. The news should have been a relief, but it landed with a thud in Nora's chest. It meant this was over. It meant Jake would be leaving. "I'll arrange for a wagon," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The trail's too rough for him to ride yet." The journey back to the homestead was quiet, thick with unspoken words. A new distance had settled between them. But as they crested the final hill, Nora gasped. The homestead was transformed. The sagging porch was repaired. The roof was patched. The yard was clear. Firewood was stacked neatly by the door. "Jake, did you do all this?" He kept his eyes on the trail. "Had some time on my hands." Tears pricked her eyes. This man's kindness was an ocean, and she was drowning in it. Inside, the cabin was just as changed. Clean, organized, with wildflowers in a jar on the table, and a pot of stew simmering on the stove. After they settled a sleepy Billy into his bed, Jake stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand, the way he always did when he was about to leave. "Well," he said, "I should be getting back to town." Panic seized her. "So soon?" "Got business to attend to," he said vaguely. "But I'll check in on you in a day or two." It wasn't what she wanted to hear. She wanted him to stay. She wanted to tell him that this place felt more like home with him in it than it had in 3 years. But she couldn't. All she could do was nod and force a smile. "Take care of yourself, Nora Matthews," he said. And then he was gone. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any she had ever known. She stood in the doorway, an empty ache spreading through her chest. "Don't be a fool," she whispered to the empty air. He was just being kind. But as she lay in her bed that night, the scent of his wood smoke and leather scent still lingering in the cabin, she couldn't make her heart believe it. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence. 3 days of scanning the horizon, hoping for a rider who never came. On the 4th day, riders did come. But it wasn't Jake. It was 3 of them. And the man in the lead was Frank Sawyer, a local rancher with cold eyes and a greedy smile, who had been pressuring her to sell her land ever since Robert died. "Billy, go inside," she said sharply. "Mrs. Matthews," Sawyer called out, his voice slick with false charm. "Heard your boy was sick. Just checking in." His eyes roamed over the repaired porch, the neat yard. "Place is looking improved. Seems you've had some help." "I manage," Nora said stiffly. "That's the problem," he said, stepping closer. She could smell the whiskey on his breath. "A pretty woman like you shouldn't be out here alone. My offer is more than fair. You could set yourself up in town. Find a proper husband instead of taking charity from some no-account drifter." Her temper flared. "Mr. Turner is a friend, and my home is not for sale." Sawyer's friendly mask dropped. His face hardened into something ugly. "Be reasonable, woman. This isn't about the land. It's about the water. Cottonwood Creek runs right through your property. And I need that water." His voice lowered to a growl. "Claims can be challenged, especially when a property isn't being properly worked. I'll be back in a week for your answer. For your boy's sake. I hope it's the right one." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. He and his men rode away, but not before one of them deliberately knocked over her basket of clean laundry, spilling it into the dust. As soon as they were gone, Nora's legs gave out. She sank onto the porch steps, trembling. That night, she took Robert's old revolver from its hiding spot. She checked it, loaded it, and placed it by her bed. She was alone again. And this time, the fight wasn't against a fever. It was against a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The next morning, she heard the sound of a wagon. Her hand flew to the revolver. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the window, peering out. And then she saw him. It was Jake. Relief washed over her so intensely she almost collapsed. She ran outside, not even caring that she was still in her nightdress. He wasn't alone. Beside him was an older man with silver-streaked hair and the steady gaze of a lifelong rancher. "Nora," Jake said, his eyes lighting up when he saw her, then clouding with concern. "Everything all right?" "It is now," she breathed. The older man was Henry Blackwood, owner of the massive Circle B ranch, an old friend of Jake's, and he had a proposal. He didn't want to buy her land. He wanted to partner with her. He wanted to lease 10 acres to plant an orchard, providing the capital, the workers, and a guaranteed market. And something else, his protection. "I understand Frank Sawyer's been making things difficult," Henry said, his face serious. "He and I go way back. If you're under my protection, he'll think twice." It was a lifeline, a way to save her home, to provide for Billy, a way to finally be safe. She looked at Jake, who had gone to his friend, who had brought this solution to her doorstep. "Why?" she asked him when Henry stepped away to look at the land. "Why do you care so much?" Jake looked out at the horizon. "I told you about my sister. What I didn't say was that I got her letter asking for help too late. I was too busy drifting." His voice was rough with old pain. "By the time I got there, she and my nephew were already in the ground." He finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes raw with emotion. "I couldn't help her. But then I saw you, riding into town with your sick boy, looking like you were carrying the weight of the whole world on your shoulders, and you were determined to carry it anyway." He took a step closer. "I wasn't going to be too late again." The confession hung in the air between them, the simple, devastating honesty of it. "And now," she whispered, "are you still just passing through?" His hand came up, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. "That depends," he said, his voice barely audible, "on whether there's a reason to stay." The world seemed to stop. The air crackled with unspoken words, with a hope so fierce it hurt. But just as she was about to answer, the sound of a horse approaching at a full gallop shattered the moment. It was one of Henry Blackwood's men. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Blackwood, it's the doctor, Dr. Henderson. He's been shot." The words struck Nora like a physical blow. The kind doctor who had saved Billy's life. "What happened?" Jake demanded, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. "It was Sawyer," the ranch hand gasped. "They had words in the street. Sawyer pulled his gun. The doctor's dead." A cold dread washed over Nora. Sawyer was a bully and a drunk. But murder? This was more than just a dispute over water rights. This was something else entirely. Something dark and twisted was happening in Sweetwater. And she and Billy were standing right in the middle of it. Jake's face had become a mask of cold fury. He looked at Nora, and in his eyes she saw it. This wasn't just a shock to him. It was something personal. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice hard as iron. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Henry." "Where are you going?" she cried as he swung onto his horse. "To see the sheriff," he yelled back. "It's time to end this." But as he rode off, a terrible thought clawed at Nora's mind. The sheriff in Sweetwater was a weak man, known to be friendly with Frank Sawyer. Going to him wasn't just useless, it was dangerous. Jake was riding into a trap. She had to warn him. But she couldn't leave Billy. She was trapped, a prisoner in her own home, while the man who had become her entire world rode towards a gunslinger and a crooked lawman. She paced the small cabin, Robert's heavy revolver in her hand. Hours crawled by. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody shades of red and orange. Every sound from outside made her jump. Was it Jake returning, or was it Sawyer coming to finish what he started? Then she heard it, a single wagon approaching slowly. Her heart leaped. She ran to the window. It was Henry Blackwood's wagon, but Henry wasn't driving. A grim-faced ranch hand was. In the back of the wagon, under a dusty blanket, was a long, still shape. No, it couldn't be. The ranch hand stopped the wagon in the yard. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Blackwood sent me. He said He said you needed to be brought to town. For your own safety. Where is Jake? She demanded, her voice shaking. What's under the blanket? The man swallowed hard. It's the sheriff, ma'am. Sawyer shot him too. Right in his office. Then he rode out of town with his men. Relief that it wasn't Jake warred with a new, sharper terror. Sawyer had killed 2 men. He was a rabid dog, off the leash, and he was still out there. Jake? She asked again, her voice pleading. He went after them, the man said quietly. Him and Mr. Blackwood. They're hunting him. 1 man against a killer and his gang. It was a suicide mission, and Henry Blackwood was an old man. What chance did they have? Get in the wagon, ma'am, the ranch hand urged. It ain't safe for you and the boy out here. She knew he was right. She grabbed a sleeping Billy, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. As they rode towards Sweetwater, away from her home, she looked back at the vast, darkening landscape. Jake was out there somewhere, hunting a monster, and for the first time she let herself admit the truth. She was falling in love with him, and she might have already lost him. They arrived in a town gripped by fear. The bodies of the doctor and the sheriff had been taken to the undertakers. The streets were empty. People were locked in their homes, terrified that Sawyer would return. Henry Blackwood had installed Nora and Billy in the boarding house again, with 2 of his men standing guard outside her door. It felt like a cage. The night was endless. She sat in a chair by the window, watching the empty street, praying for a sign, for the sight of a black stallion riding into town. But the street remained empty. The next day was the same. A thick, heavy blanket of silence and fear lay over the town. There was no word, no news, just the awful, gaping unknown. Was he alive? Was he hurt? Was he gone? On the second morning, one of the guards knocked on her door. Ma'am, Mr. Blackwood is back. Nora's heart hammered. She flew down the stairs. Henry was in the dining room, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. He was covered in dust, and he was alone. Her blood ran cold. Where's Jake? Henry looked at her, his eyes full of a sorrow so deep it was bottomless. We tracked them to the canyons, he said, his voice hoarse. There was a fight. Sawyer's men. They had the high ground. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Jake. He rode straight at them, drew their fire so I could get a better position. It was the bravest thing I've ever seen. He couldn't finish. He didn't have to. The world tilted. The floor fell away from beneath her feet. The single word hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. Gone. The hope she had so carefully nurtured withered and died. The laughter, the kindness, the promise of a future, all of it snatched away. She was alone again. More alone than she had ever been before. We got Sawyer, Henry continued, his voice thick. And his men. It's over. You're safe now. But she wasn't safe. Her heart had been ripped out of her chest. What was a safe home, a safe town, without him in it? The next few days passed in a gray, numb fog. Henry Blackwood handled everything. He filed the paperwork for their partnership. He hired a new foreman to oversee the work at her homestead. He promised her she and Billy would never have to worry about anything again. He was kind, paternal, a rock in her sea of grief. But every act of kindness was a fresh wound, because it should have been Jake. 1 week after the shootout, Henry came to her room. He was holding a worn leather satchel. We found this on one of Sawyer's men, he said gently. It's Jake's. Her hands trembled as she took it. Inside was a small, tattered Bible, a few dollars, and a folded yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter. She unfolded it. The handwriting was faint, the paper soft with age. It was from a woman, his sister, the one he had told her about. Dearest Jake, it began. The fever is worse. Little Tommy is so weak. The doctor says there is little hope. I am writing to you not to ask for help, for I fear it is too late for that. I am writing to tell you about Robert. Nora's breath hitched. Robert, her Robert. He came through here last month. He was a good man, Jake, a kind man. He told me about the robbery, about how it all went wrong. He never meant for anyone to get hurt. He told me where he hid the money. He said if anything ever happened to him, he wanted you to have his share, to take care of me and Tommy. He made me memorize the location, under the lightning-struck oak, by Cottonwood Creek. Nora dropped the letter as if it had burned her. The lightning-struck oak, on her property, the turnoff to her homestead. Robert, her husband, the gentle farmer she had mourned for 3 years, was a thief, a bank robber, and Jake knew. His story about his sister wasn't just a story, it was real, and her husband was tied up in it. Was that why Jake had helped her? Had his kindness all been a lie? Was he just after the money? The thought was a dagger to her already shattered heart. She looked at Henry Blackwood, her mind reeling. "Did you know?" she whispered. Henry's kind face was a mask of sympathy. "I'm so sorry you had to find out this way, Nora. Jake told me the whole story. Robert was his friend. They served in the war together. Jake was trying to find the money to honor his friend's last wish, to take care of his sister's family. When he found you and Billy instead, he knew what he had to do. He wanted to protect you, from Sawyer, and from the truth. It was all too much, lies built on lies. Her entire life, her marriage, was a fiction. The man she'd fallen in love with had been searching for a fortune on her land, but he had died protecting her. He had given his life to stop Sawyer. That couldn't be a lie. Could it? The money, she said, her voice numb. It's still there. It doesn't matter now, Henry said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's blood money. Leave it be. You and Billy are what's important. I'll take care of you, I promise. His words should have been a comfort, but they weren't. Something was wrong. Something was gnawing at the edges of her mind. The doctor. Why would Sawyer kill the doctor? It made no sense. Unless the doctor was involved too. And another thought. A cold, slithering snake of a thought. Henry said he and Jake had gone after Sawyer together. He said Jake had drawn their fire. He said he had been the one to take Sawyer down. He was the only witness, the only one left alive to tell the tale. He was the hero, and Jake was the ghost. She looked up at Henry Blackwood, at his kind, weathered face, his sad, sympathetic eyes. And for the first time, she saw something else lurking behind them, something cold, something patient, something that had been waiting a very, very long time. The story he told was perfect, too perfect. A brave hero's sacrifice, a grieving friend's promise. It tied up every loose end. It left him in control of everything. Her land, her future, and the location of a stolen fortune. A cold, terrifying certainty began to dawn in Nora's mind. She was in a room with the man who had brought her salvation, and she was looking into the eyes of a killer. The pieces started clicking into place, forming a picture so monstrous Nora could barely breathe. Henry Blackwood, the kind old rancher, the grieving friend, the protector. What if he wasn't any of those things, she thought back. Henry had shown up with Jake at the perfect moment. He had a ready-made solution to her Sawyer problem. He mentioned he and Sawyer go way back. Everyone assumed it was a rivalry. What if it was a partnership? And the doctor, Dr. Henderson. Sawyer had supposedly killed him in the street. But what if that wasn't the real story? The letter. Jake's sister's letter. It mentioned Robert, and it mentioned the money. Jake had that letter. He must have shown it to Henry, which meant Henry knew about the money too. What if this was never about water rights? What if it was always about the stolen payroll? What if Sawyer, Henderson, and Henry were all part of the same gang as her husband, Robert? And what if they had a falling out? Nora's mind raced, connecting the dots. Robert hides the money and disappears. His partners search for years. They finally track him to his homestead, but he's already dead. All that's left is his widow and child, sitting on top of a fortune they don't know exists. Sawyer was the muscle, sent to scare her off the land. But she was stubborn, and then Jake Turner showed up, a wild card, a man with his own connection to the past. He complicated things, so the partners decided to accelerate their plan. Henderson, the doctor, was the brains. But maybe he got greedy. Maybe he made a move to double-cross the others. So Henry and Sawyer eliminated him. They staged the murder to look like a drunken fight. Then they eliminated the only law in town, the sheriff, to ensure no one would ask any hard questions. That left one final problem. Jake, the man who knew too much. Henry's story about the canyon, it was a lie. There was a fight, yes, but Henry wasn't on Jake's side. He had led Jake into an ambush. It was Henry who had killed Jake, and then he had killed Sawyer, his own partner, to tie up the last loose end. He had orchestrated a massacre and emerged as the town's savior, the sole survivor, the sole inheritor of the secret. And now he had her, the grieving widow, completely dependent on him, trusting him, ready to be molded and moved wherever he wanted. He didn't even have to search for the money. He just had to wait for her to lead him to it. The room suddenly felt cold, airless. The two guards Henry had posted outside her door weren't there for her protection. They were there to keep her in. She was a prisoner. Her blood ran like ice water in her veins. But on the outside, she forced herself to be calm. She looked up at Henry, tears welling in her eyes. Real tears, but not for the reason he thought. "Thank you, Henry," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." His face softened with that same paternal sympathy. It was sickening. "It's all taken care of, my dear," he said, patting her hand. "You just rest. You and the boy are safe now." He left. She heard him give instructions to the guards outside. She was alone. But for how long? He was patient, yes, but his patience wouldn't last forever. He would start pushing her soon, gently at first, to remember things Robert might have said, to lead him to the treasure. She had to get out. She looked at Billy sleeping peacefully in the bed, oblivious to the monster that was circling them. She thought of Jake. Brave, kind Jake. Had he really died in that canyon? Or was there a chance, just a sliver of a chance, that the monster had failed? No, that was a fool's hope. She was on her own. She had to save her son. She thought about the boarding house. She had stayed here before. She knew the layout. Her room was on the second floor. The window looked out over an alley. It was at least a 15-foot drop. Too far. But there was a trellis, covered in old, thick ivy, running up the wall right next to her window. Was it strong enough? She had to try. That night she waited until the town was dark and silent. She packed a small bag with what little food was in the room and Robert's revolver. She scribbled a hasty note and left it on the pillow. Gone to the homestead, needed to be home. It was a lie to buy her time. When the guards found it in the morning, they would assume she'd just walked out the front door. They would go to the homestead first. That would give her a head start. She wrapped a sleeping Billy in a blanket, whispering that it was a game. He stirred, but thankfully didn't fully wake. Tying him securely to her back with a sheet was the hardest part. His small, warm weight was both a comfort and a terror. If she fell, they both died. She slipped the window open. The night air was cold. She looked down at the dark alley. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She slung the bag over her shoulder, took a deep breath, and swung her legs over the sill. Her fingers gripped the thick, woody vines of the trellis. They felt ancient, strong. She tested her weight. It held. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to climb down, her bare feet searching for holds in the dark. Billy's weight made every movement awkward and dangerous. A board creaked on the floor of her room. She froze, pressing herself flat against the brick wall. Had one of the guards heard her? She held her breath, listening. Silence. A false alarm. She continued her descent. Her arms burned, her fingers were raw. Finally, her feet touched the soft, muddy ground of the alley. She had done it. She unwrapped Billy, who was starting to wake up. "Shh, baby, it's okay," she whispered, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "We're going on an adventure." She couldn't stay in Sweetwater. Henry would have the whole town looking for her as soon as her absence was discovered. The homestead was the first place he'd look. She couldn't go there. So where could she go? She needed a horse. She needed supplies. The livery stable was at the other end of town. Too risky. But Jake had kept his black stallion there. A powerful, fast horse that knew the wilderness. It was her only chance. She crept through the back alleys of the town she had once seen as a sanctuary. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every stray dog's bark was a death knell. She reached the stable. The main doors were barred, but there was a small hayloft window on the side. She found a stack of crates. Leaving Billy hidden behind a rain barrel, she climbed. The window was latched from the inside. She used the butt of the revolver to carefully, quietly break the small pane of glass. She reached through, unlatched it, and slipped inside, landing silently in the soft hay. The stable was quiet, smelling of hay and horse. In the last stall she saw him, the black stallion. He snorted softly as she approached. "Easy, boy," she whispered, stroking his powerful neck. "We're friends of Jake's." She found Jake's saddle and bridle. She was no expert horsewoman, but she knew the basics. She worked quickly, her hands shaking. She led the stallion out of his stall. She had to get Billy and go. Just as she reached the back door, she heard voices from the front of the stable. "Check every stall. The boss said she's clever." It was Henry's men. They were already looking for her. Her note hadn't fooled them for a second. Panic flared. There was no way out the back. She was trapped. She looked around desperately. Her eyes landed on the hayloft. It was her only option. Leading the massive stallion up the narrow ramp to the loft was a clumsy, noisy process. He balked, but she urged him on, her voice a desperate whisper. They made it to the top just as the stable doors creaked open. She peered through a crack in the floorboards. Two of Henry's men entered, lanterns held high. They started checking the stalls one by one. She was trapped 20 feet above them, with a horse, and her son was outside alone, hidden behind a barrel. How long until he cried out? How long until they found him? Time seemed to slow down. The men were getting closer. Their voices drifted up. "Don't see how she could have gotten out." The guards were at her door. "Blackwood's gonna have our hides if we don't find her." They checked the last stall, the one the stallion had been in. It was empty. "Well, she ain't here. Let's check the undertaker's. Maybe she went to see the body." The suggestion was morbid, but it was their salvation. The men turned and left, closing the heavy doors behind them. Silence returned. Nora waited, her heart pounding, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she led the stallion back down. She retrieved a terrified but quiet Billy. She swung into the saddle, pulling her son up in front of her. She couldn't use the roads. They'd be watching the roads. She looked to the east, towards the jagged, dark shapes of the canyons. The place where they said Jake had died. It was the last place they would expect her to go. It was dangerous country, wild and unforgiving, but it was her only hope. She urged the stallion into a gallop, leaving the nightmare of Sweetwater behind her, and plunged into the darkness of the wilderness. She was running from a monster, towards a ghost, with nothing but a stolen horse and a desperate prayer. This wasn't a race against a fever anymore. This was a race for her life. The canyons were a maze of rock and shadow. The stallion, sure-footed and powerful, moved through the treacherous landscape with an unsettling familiarity. It was as if the horse knew this land, knew its secrets. For 2 days, Nora pushed them onward, stopping only for brief moments of rest. She had no food left, and the water in her canteen was dangerously low. Billy, bless his heart, was brave, but she could see the fear and exhaustion in his small face. She had no idea where she was going. She was just putting distance between herself and Sweetwater, between herself and Henry Blackwood. On the third day, the horse stopped. It refused to go any further, standing stubbornly before a sheer rock wall. "Come on," she urged, but the horse wouldn't budge. It pawed at the ground, snorting. Despair began to set in. Had they reached a dead end? Was this where they would die of thirst and starvation, in the middle of nowhere? Then she saw it, a slight discoloration in the rock, a patch of brush that seemed out of place. She dismounted, pushing the brush aside. Behind it was a dark opening, a cave. The horse had led her here. With Billy clinging to her hand, she entered the darkness. The air was cool. A few feet in, the cave opened up into a larger chamber, and in the center of the chamber was the faint, flickering light of a dying campfire. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. She pushed Billy behind her, raising the revolver, her hand trembling. A figure stirred from the shadows by the fire. A man, wrapped in a dusty blanket. He was gaunt, his face bruised and cut, his arm in a makeshift sling. He slowly looked up. His eyes were a piercing blue. The revolver slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the stone floor. A single word escaped her lips, a breath, a prayer. Jake. He wasn't a ghost. He was real. He was alive. She ran to him, falling to her knees, her tears finally breaking free. He reached for her with his good arm, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Nora, he rasped, his voice rough. How did you find me? The horse, she sobbed into his shoulder. He led me here. Knew I bought a smart animal, he murmured, his grip tightening. The story came tumbling out of him. It was just as she'd suspected. Henry had led him into an ambush, but they had underestimated him. He'd taken a bullet in the shoulder and a nasty fall, but he'd managed to get away in the chaos, hiding in the canyons he knew from his years as a marshal. Henry, thinking him dead or dying, had focused on eliminating Sawyer and securing the town. He's not a rancher, Nora, Jake said, his face grim. He was my captain in the marshal service. He planned the whole payroll robbery from the inside. Robert, Sawyer, Henderson, they were his men. He betrayed everyone. The truth was even worse than she'd imagined. The man hunting her wasn't just a killer. He was a traitor with the training and resources of a U.S. Marshal. He thinks I'm dead, Jake continued. That's our only advantage. But he has you and Billy. We have to get you somewhere safe. He doesn't have us, Nora said, a new strength flowing through her. She was no longer the desperate woman who had ridden into Sweetwater. She had faced down monsters and climbed down walls. She had survived. We escaped. She told him everything. Her suspicions, the guards, the climb down the trellis, the stable. Jake looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. You climbed down a wall with the boy on your back? I had to, she said simply. He pulled her close again, his face buried in her hair. You're the strongest person I've ever known. But they weren't safe yet. Blackwood would be hunting her with a frenzy now. He wouldn't just have his own men. He'd likely have a posse of duped townspeople, telling them she was a hysterical widow who had stolen a horse and kidnapped her own son. There's only one way to beat him, Jake said, his eyes hard. We can't outrun him forever. We have to expose him. And to do that, he winced as he tried to sit up straighter. We need proof, and we need the money. Nora's heart sank. The money, but how? It's buried back at the homestead. Jake managed a faint, grim smile. Is it? He looked at her. Robert was a clever man, but he was sentimental. He wouldn't have just buried it in a random spot. He would have hidden it somewhere meaningful. Somewhere he looked at every day. A place no one would ever think to dig. She thought of the homestead, the small cabin, the barn, the fields. Where would he look every day? And then it hit her. The hearth, the great stone fireplace Robert had built with his own 2 hands. It was the heart of their home. He had been so proud of it. And one of the stones, it had always been loose. He'd said it gave it character. The fireplace, she breathed. Exactly, Jake said. We have to get back there, before Blackwood does. It was an insane plan, to go back to the one place the entire territory would be searching for them, to walk back into the lion's den. He'll have men watching the place, Nora said. I know, Jake replied, but they'll be watching for a woman and a child on a black stallion, not for a ghost. He had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan. He would go alone under the cover of darkness. He would retrieve the money and hopefully find some other proof Robert might have hidden with it. Nora and Billy would stay hidden in the cave, a secret rendezvous point arranged for 3 days' time. No, Nora said, her voice firm. We're not separating again. I'm not hiding while you walk into a trap. We do this together. Jake looked at her, ready to argue, but he saw the iron resolve in her eyes. He saw the woman who had climbed down a wall with her son on her back, and he nodded. Together, then. They traveled by night, resting during the day, Jake's knowledge of the terrain keeping them hidden. His shoulder was healing, but he was still weak. Nora tended to his wound, her hands gentle but sure. In the quiet moments, in the shared darkness, the unspoken feelings between them grew, a fragile, beautiful thing in the heart of the danger. They reached the hills overlooking the homestead 2 nights later. They watched from a distance. Just as Jake had predicted, Two of Blackwood's men were camped out near the barn, keeping a lazy watch. "We wait for the moon to set," Jake whispered, his arm around her as they lay hidden in the rocks. "Then we go." The wait was agonizing. Finally, the world was plunged into near total darkness. Leaving the stallion hidden, they crept towards the cabin, moving like shadows. Billy, bless his soul, seemed to understand, staying utterly silent, his small hand gripping Nora's. They reached the cabin wall. The windows were dark. Jake tested the back door. Locked. He pulled a thin knife from his boot and went to work on the latch. After an agonizingly long minute, there was a soft click. They slipped inside. The cabin was cold and silent, but it was filled with Blackwood's presence. Things were moved, drawers left open. He had been here. He had searched, but he hadn't found it. They moved to the fireplace. Jake ran his fingers along the stones. He found the loose one. Using his knife, he carefully pried it out. Behind it was a dark cavity. Reaching inside, he pulled out a rotted leather satchel. It was heavy. This was it, the payroll money. But behind it was something else, a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Nora's hands trembled as she opened it. It wasn't more money. It was a book, a ledger. And inside, in Robert's familiar handwriting, was everything. The names of the gang members, Sawyer, Henderson, the details of the robbery, and the name of the man who planned it all, the man who was supposed to be their inside contact at the marshal's office, Captain Henry Blackwood. But there was one more entry, a final, shocking twist that made the blood freeze in Nora's veins. Robert had written, "Blackwood is getting greedy. He plans to kill us all after the job and keep the money for himself. I can't let that happen." Henderson agrees. "We have a plan. We've hidden the real payroll. What's in the satchel behind this stone is counterfeit, just enough to fool him. The real money, we moved it to the safest place we could think of. Deposit Box 42, Sweetwater Bank." It was a double cross and a triple cross, and the man holding the proof, Dr. Henderson, was dead. Robert was dead, which meant no one knew the money in their hands was fake, except for them. A floorboard creaked on the porch. Jake moved in a flash, pushing Nora and Billy behind him, his own gun drawn. The cabin door swung open. Framed in the doorway, lantern held high, was Henry Blackwood. A cold, triumphant smile spread across his face. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "A woman always returns to her nest." His eyes flickered to the satchel in Jake's hand. "And it seems you found what I was looking for. Hand it over, Marshal. Your fight is over." Behind him, more of his men appeared, rifles leveled. They were surrounded, trapped. This was it, the end of the line. But Jake Turner didn't look scared. He looked at Nora, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. He slowly placed the satchel on the floor. "You're right, Henry," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "The fight is over, but not the way you think." He kicked the satchel. It slid across the floor, stopping at Blackwood's feet. Blackwood's eyes gleamed with greed. He bent to pick it up, and in that moment all hell broke loose. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a voice from outside. "Blackwood, drop the weapon. You're surrounded." Blackwood froze. His head snapped up, his face a mask of disbelief. "What?" Through the open door they could see them, a dozen men emerging from the darkness. Townspeople, farmers, and at their head was a man wearing a tin star on his chest. A new sheriff, deputized just that morning. Blackwood's men hesitated, looking from their boss to the armed townsfolk. Their loyalty was to money, not to a man who was clearly on the losing side. "How?" Blackwood snarled, his eyes locking on Jake. Jake smiled. "You taught me to always have a backup plan, Captain. When Nora and Billy escaped, I knew you'd get desperate. So I sent a message with a friend, told him to gather every man in town who was tired of being afraid. Seems there were quite a few." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. He knew he was beaten, but he wasn't going down alone. He lunged for Nora, grabbing her, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "Nobody moves or the woman dies," he screamed, but he underestimated her. Nora wasn't a victim anymore. She drove her elbow back, hard into Blackwood's ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She dropped to the floor, and in the same instant, a single shot rang out. Not from Jake, not from the posse, from Billy. He was standing by the table, his small hands holding Robert's heavy revolver with a steadiness that defied his age. He hadn't fired at Blackwood. He had fired at the lantern, which exploded, plunging the room into darkness and chaos. Jake tackled Blackwood. The posse stormed the cabin. It was over in seconds. When a new lantern was lit, Henry Blackwood was in cuffs, his reign of terror finished. In the aftermath, Jake held Nora close, his hand resting on Billy's head. "You saved us, partner," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Later, when the posse had taken Blackwood away, Jake made one last confession to Nora. The letter from his sister. It was real, but he had left one part out. His sister hadn't just been Robert's friend. They had planned to get married. He had been riding to her wedding when he got the news of her death. Robert was going to be his brother-in-law. "My quest was always for justice," he said, his blue eyes searching hers. "For them. But somewhere along the way, hunting a ghost, I found a life instead." The counterfeit money was recovered from the hearth. And the real payroll? It was found in deposit box 42 at the Sweetwater Bank, just as the ledger said. The town was safe. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. Nora stood with Jake on the porch of her homestead, watching the sun rise. It was her home, truly hers now. Billy was asleep inside, safe. "So," she said, a small smile playing on her lips, "are you still just passing through, Jake Turner?" He turned to her, his own smile finally reaching his eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. He took her hand. "Nora Matthews," he said, his voice soft. "I've been running my whole life. I'm done running. I think I'm finally home." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that wasn't about desperation or fear, but about a new beginning, about a future they would build together. They had walked through fire and faced down monsters, and had come out the other side stronger, together. The journey that started with a desperate ride to save a life had ended up saving them all. The story of Nora and Jake proves that even in the darkest of nights, hope can ride in on a black stallion. It shows that the greatest treasures aren't buried under a rock, but are found in the courage we dig up from inside ourselves. If you enjoyed this wild ride through the Old West, and you love stories where the heroes are forged in the fires of adversity, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales that prove the truth is always wilder than fiction. And let me know in the comments, what was the most shocking twist you didn't see coming? Thanks for listening.